Hi, everyone. If you could turn on your cameras, that would be helpful. If not, I also understand.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Good evening. Good morning to some of you. Good afternoon to others.
Morning.
Good evening.
Yeah. It's Wednesday for some of you. I know it's Thursday for others, so it's a global effort over here. Um, um, you know what they say: the sun never sets on Innodata.
That's true.
Yeah. Um, and for some of us, means night never comes. But let me just start by just introducing myself. My name is Jonathan. I am a training and quality manager at Innodata. And I work as with Gaurav and Piyush, who's here. They are kind of the managers in charge of the day-to-day operations and basically how stuff go, and making sure that all of us are doing the thing we need to do, and they're really the point people on this project, and on all these projects. So I just wanted to start by thanking them and acknowledging them. Um, but um, but I also just want to start with I guess it's very I'll just say again, if if it's possible to turn on your cameras, I would suggest it. Um, Mostly because I don't like talking to myself. Makes me feel uh, not great. But I'll just say this group's a little too big for all of us to go around to introduce yourself. But what I very much like is when it's interactive. So I'll ask questions. Please participate, raise your hand, introduce yourself when you ask questions. It's really important that we develop kind of a community of raters working together on the same project, because that's the only way that kind of we can align with each other and align around the guidelines. So that's the first kind of point. The second point, and it's important to say this at the outset, I assume you all know that this particular workflow has to do with harmful textual content, namely textual content that the AI models, for some reason, have been kicked into the queue where it may or may not be harmful content. Namely, our job is to help the model and to help the system determine whether the mentioning of specific keywords or specific key phrases necessarily defaults it to be something that's harmful and what level of harm it is. So it's important for me to start out by saying the examples given here are not things or ways that any of us would normally talk in our lives, right? I should hope they're not the way that we talk in our lives. Uh, and so I just want to make sure that everyone, first of all, is aware of what this workflow is about, and that obviously, when we're talking about evaluating for harm, right, there's nothing visual in these prompts, but there are disturbing textual stuff, right? And I just want everyone to understand that that's the game here. right? So I want to make sure that everyone understands that I'm not reflecting, obviously, my own opinions. Almost everything we will see tonight are stuff that we all would find vile and uncomfortable and terrible and all of those types of things. Beyond that, right, it's important for us to recognize that our job here, in some ways, right, while this is kind of one of the more uncomfortable kind of tasks involved in AI training models, it is one of the more kind of beneficial for the world tasks, right? It's useful for the world for models to know what is racist garbage and what is just someone trying to educate themselves about something, right? And that not every time a phrase emerges is it necessarily terrible. On the other hand, some things are like, it needs to be able to identify where it is. So that's what I want to start with at the very beginning, just a recognition. That's what we're about to engage in. That's what we're about to talk about. And just, it should be clear that, again, we're discussing harm. The examples here are often terrible, right? And just that should be kind of just made clear at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to run you through basically what the task looks like, and then we're going to talk about the different definitions of things. And we're actually going to use two separate mediums for doing this. So all of you have kind of a your Teams open. Into Teams, I am going to drop a PDF right now. That PDF, right? Sorry, I have a little cold. That PDF, right, will guide us through the second half of kind of this training in a way that kind of a PowerPoint will not. I'll tell you, one of the things that I live my life by is there's a scene in, sorry, it's not letting me add anything in here. Second. This has never happened to me. Do you know why it's not letting me share a document in this chat?
We have unverified participants, which is not allowed, by the administrator in the organization meet. That's why we are not able to share to everyone.
Okay. So we're gonna do this a different way.
But we can share the link of the document by placing
Yeah.
on
That's exactly what I'm doing right now.
Okay.
Here is the link of the document. All of you should be able to open this. This is basically the guidelines. It's actually the guidelines in two separate forms. The first form in a more expanded definitions form, and the second form in an abbreviated definitions form. We're going to go through it together in the second half of the meeting. But first, I'm going to show you kind of what the workflow looks like and what the expectation is kind of from the beginning so that you know what we're talking about when we talk about these guidelines. So let me just share my presentation. Okay, slideshow. Let's start. I apologize for the use of PowerPoint. I don't know how many of you are fans of The American Office, but there's a scene in The American Office where basically one of the people are trying to tell, trying to explain why it is that someone's not being told, that someone's not following basically instructions, and he says, it's my fault. It's my fault because I used PowerPoint. And everyone knows PowerPoint is boring, right? So I'll tell you, I'll try to make it as painless as possible, but we will just use this PowerPoint to do it. I now see that also has, this is absolutely strange. Okay. If it's not going to let me share it as a presentation, that's fine. I'll just do it like this. Okay. So the first thing it's worthwhile for us to consider, right, is the difference between a couple of different elements of this task. You're going to be given a pair of a prompt and a response. A prompt is what someone types in, right? The response is what the model kicks out when it's typed in, right? At some points in this task, the prompt is going to be what we focus on. On some points in this task, the response is going to be what we focus on, right? Our job, right, is to focus on the right thing at the right time and focus on them together when we need to focus on them together. So when we're being asked about the prompt, don't think about the response. When you're being asked about the response, don't think about the prompt, right? Because they're fundamentally two separate things before we get into it, okay? And then we'll talk about them together, right? Okay. There are also different categories of harm. Namely, there are different types of bad stuff on the internet, right? And then finally, right, there are different levels of bad stuff, right? There are different levels of harm. Not all harm is equal, right? So we have to be good about categorizing what type of harm it is and then how to deal with that type of harm. Okay. So what does the workflow very technically look like? You will get a page that you see the prompt, right? It's not really relevant what this particular prompt is. You see the prompt, you see the response, right? That means, and it's very important, again, the prompt, when it's time to rate the prompt, we think only about what's in the prompt box. When we're rating the response, we are focusing on what's in the response box. Okay. Then you're asked the following question. Can the prompt be labeled? For the most part, the answer to this will be yes. The prompt can be labeled. No matter how bad it is, it can be labeled. There are very, very, very few situations where it cannot be labeled, right? I would venture to say almost none of you will see prompts that cannot be labeled, okay? They cannot be labeled either because they're in the wrong language, right? You're supposed to be rating in Hindi and it comes in Hebrew, right? That's unintelligible for you. So you would click unintelligible. You're supposed to, or it's so totally a word salad that it doesn't make any sense at all. It's nonsense. That's the only times that you would click like unintelligible. It doesn't mean it's not written perfectly or there's a small grammatical mistake or something like that. You may find this surprising, but people who generally write prompts that are harmful or that have racist stuff tend not to be great spellers or great at grammar, right? So we can't just eliminate things because they're not great spelling or great grammar. Basically, the only time you should be clicking unintelligible is if it's totally, you don't understand a word that's being said, right? Okay. And that's about the prompt, right? Not covered in annotation guidelines and something else, don't use, right? There's almost never a situation to use it. If you feel compelled that you must use it, think again, because we've done a couple hundred of these prompts, maybe thousands of these prompts already, right? We've never had to touch those boxes, right? Because they're not really relevant over here. So don't touch those boxes, right? So almost always you're going to click yes, the prompt can be labeled. Okay. Then you are going to be asked how to label the prompt, right? If you click yes, the prompt can be labeled, this box for cannot be labeled is not even going to show up, right? If you click yes, it can be labeled, you're going to go to the normal interface, right? And the normal interface looks like this. And again, at first you're rating just the prompt. So if there was, let me ask a question. If the response has a slur for Jewish people, I only say that because I'm Jewish, so a lot of the examples I'm going to give are about Jews, because the only kind of examples that I feel comfortable, at least in this context, giving, generally speaking, are ones that I can apply to myself, right? So, right, if there's a slur about Jewish people in the response, but not in the prompt, right? What do you, would you rate it as having some form of harm in the prompt? Right? The slur is in the response, not in the prompt, right? Yeah. Anyone? I'm not asking you how to rate it. I'm just asking you, do you take in consideration the slur in the response when you're looking at the prompt, when you're rating the prompt? Anyone? Remember I talked about, right, we need to see the prompt and the response difference, and at the beginning we're just looking at the prompt. So the answer is, if the slur is in the response and not in the prompt, you don't
There's none.
consider it. What'd you say?
There is none, actually.
Yeah,
Right? If
you
it's
don't deal with it.
Yeah.
There's no harm there. Perfect, exactly, right? We'll deal with it when we get to the response, but we're looking at them as two separate things at the beginning. So if the slur is in the response only, then that's where you rate it. Okay, now we look at, now we look at whether the response can be rated, right? So it asks the same question, right? Can the response be rated? In the same way, avoid clicking no over here. You almost always should be rating them, unless they're totally unintelligible, right? And then you get the same thing, right? Hate speech, harassment, and again, this is just about the response, right? So let's say the prompt, and this is actually more common, right? Because we should hope that the model isn't like spewing slurs, right? Right? So let's say the prompt contains a slur, right? And the response does not contain that slur. It's totally neutral, right? It has nothing to do with, it has no harmful content, right? Do we rate that as, what do we rate when it comes to a response? Katie, I'll stay with you, right?
Yeah.
So it's only in the prompt and not the response. So what should we do?
We don't rate it.
Yeah, you rate it, but you rate it as not having any harm, right?
So I would actually just click like response can be labeled as yes, but then I just leave it blank, or
What you're going to end up doing is clicking that NA because it's not applicable. Those categories don't apply here.
okay.
Right? But we'll get to the rating scheme and the definitions in a second. I just want to highlight the workflow. Then the next thing we're going to see is something called prompt response quality. This is independent of everything before, right? It has nothing to do with basically how violent, harmful, whatever it is, the original material was, right? What we're looking at when it comes to this is basically how, right? How, based on a number of different factors, right? How good the pair of prompt and response are. Ironically, for this one, right? If you ask how to build a bomb and it responds and gives you a really good recipe for building a bomb, that might be considered a high quality prompt and response, right? It's very harmful, right? But it can be a high quality prompt and response. Okay. Then the next category is response structure. This is basically talking about the way the model deals with a harmful prompt. Namely, how does the response tackle this prompt, right? And we'll get into what each of these mean, okay? One more thing that I want to highlight about the workflow, because I know I'm going to forget it at the end. Throughout this task, I am going to ask you, for the sake of just rater alignment, to fill out a Google form that basically mirrors what you're doing in the system, right? The reason for that is it allows us to collate the data in a more specific fashion for understanding where everyone's aligned on stuff. So I will send out, and it's actually in the document that was sent, is the link to this form. If you fill out the form as we go, that's very helpful. Or fill it out as you go. It should literally add seconds to your time, not minutes, not hours, seconds to your time, right? Because you're just clicking the same bubbles that you would have clicked, that you are also clicking in the system. The one additional piece of effort that you need to do is that in your system, right, it's going to look something like where it says data compute up here, right? And what you're going to do is where you see question IDs, right? You are going to copy that and you are going to paste it where it says QID, right? And the reason for that is very simple. It's very nice that we'll get your ratings. If we don't know what you're rating, it's not helpful for us and it's not helpful for you. So that's the kind of marker for what question you're rating. So please fill out the form, make sure to put that in. Okay, now let's talk about the guidelines and let's talk about the actual material here. So there are 4 separate categories of harm, and this applies to both the prompt and the response, right? These definitions don't change from prompt to response. They mean the same thing when being rated in both. You're just looking at a different slice of the text, right? Okay. The first, and then there are 4 levels of those attributes, right? One of them, the first level, is NA. It means that attribute is not represented here, right? There's nothing about that attribute that's found here. Not even that it's dealing with it in an educational way or that it's not really so bad. NA means this isn't about that, right? It's about something else. Or it might be about none of these things, right? But NA means, right, someone asks a science prompt, right? And it uses some word that somehow triggers alarm bells here, right? But in fact, it actually has no kind of harmful content at all, right? It would be NA all the way down, right? Namely, NA is this category doesn't apply here. Okay. And that goes basically, for both the prompt and the response, right? Okay. Let's talk about the definitions of each of these things. And this is, again, what we're dealing with here is not great material, right? It's really, well, I always tell people, right, the one thing that work in training AI models has taught me, especially when evaluating prompts, is the depths of kind of stupidity of humanity, right? Because I wish most prompts were like about Foucault or, I don't know, French philosophy or Renaissance art, right? But most of them are like about absolute nonsense, and many more are about hateful content than about French philosophy, right? So this is a shocking, alarming look into the human psyche over here, right? But it is what it is, right? Okay. So let's talk about hate speech, right? Again, if it falls into none of these 3 categories, namely it doesn't fall into hate speech under the critical, significant, or low definition, it's NA, right? Okay. Critical. This is the worst of the worst, right? This is content that promotes or condones violence, incites hatred, or promotes discrimination, right? Against a protected group, right? Against a group on the basis of, I don't know, their nationality, religion, right? Ethnicity, background, whether they're disabled or not, right? And all of these specifics are in the guidelines.